One thing that I find very interesting is A-bomb literature, and fictional works based on the very real stories of survivors of World War II, and especially the firebombings, and the atomic bombs that were dropped on Japan. When you think of anime about these topics, what comes to mind right away is usually the classics like Barefoot Gen and Grave of the Fireflies, from 1983 and 1988 respectively, or maybe even the 2016 movie, In This Corner of the World. But as I was doing my retro movie quest for my podcast, Red Leaf Retrocast, links in the description if you're interested in checking it out, I came across a few more movies that I had never heard about before. And one of those movies was the one I'll be talking about today, a movie based on the real story of Kayoko Ebina called Ushiro no Shoumen Daare. So, Ushiro no Shoumen Daare, also known by its English title, Who's Left Behind, is a historical drama from 1991 based on the novel of Kayoko Ebina, which tells her story, growing up in Japan during World War II. This movie was directed by Seiji Arihara, and the story goes something like this. Kayoko is a young girl in 1940, just starting first grade. She's a bit of a crybaby and a mama's girl, which is no secret to those around her. She loves playing with her friends and singing cute schoolyard chants, and occasionally having fun with her 3 older brothers. Her mother is pregnant, and so she looks forward to being a big sister, only partially understanding the responsibility that might bring. Meanwhile, the war effort is growing, and being patriotic and supporting the country is only the right thing to do. Kayoko goes so far as to contribute her favorite doll, whose materials could help build explosives. Time passes, and as she grows older, Kayoko sees how the war has affected her life and those around her. But nothing can prepare her for 1945 and the bleak times that are to come. So, in case you didn't know, the title of this movie is a reference to a Japanese children's game called Kagome Kagome. Basically, this is kind of similar to Ring Around the Rosie, but with an element of tag in it. One player is chosen as the Oni and sits with their eyes covered, while the rest of the kids hold hands and walk in circles around the Oni, while singing a specific song. If you've watched a lot of anime or consumed a lot of Japanese media, you've probably heard this song before. The kids also play Kagome Kagome in one of the opening scenes in this movie. However, they've changed up the lyrics a little bit. This is honestly a really good scene, as it serves as foreshadowing for the events that are to come later in the movie. The reason for that is because the song and game has a few more sinister theories about its origin and meaning. While most think that the weird lyrics just refer to the game itself and about who the Oni or the person sitting in the middle is and who they can switch places with, there has also been some who suggest that the song is about anything from a woman being forced into prostitution to a convict who's about to be executed. In this movie, however, the title is going for a more literal meaning, in the sense that it's about the people who were left behind as their family or loved ones were taken away by the war. So both the title and the game sets up really well for the eventual climax of the movie. Using the Kagome Kagome in this way is quite good. The song is vague enough that it doesn't seem to mean anything at first, but still retains a bit of that eerie feeling that the song normally has going for it. I thought this was a nice touch. But anyways, let's continue with my thoughts on the movie itself. So like I said in the beginning, this movie is similar to other anime about World War II, like Grave of the Fireflies and Barefoot Gen. What separates this movie from the others though, is that this is a bit more of a removed take from the worst of the war. They show us how some were a bit worried about going to war with England and the US, while others thought that allying with Germany would mean the US couldn't harm them. We also get to see more of what it was like when the war efforts were ramped up, and everyone had to start donating their own possessions so that the Japanese military could make ammunitions and bombs with it. But for the most part, this movie is just about Kayoko growing up in Japan during the war. And apart from the government updates over the radio from time to time, and the letters from her uncle, who's currently stationed over in China, there really isn't as much about the war here, as in for example Barefoot Gen. Honestly, this movie is more of a slice of life anime for quite a long time, and that is not a bad thing. In the second half of this movie, Kayoko moves away from Tokyo to Numazu to live with some relatives. This was because they wanted to try and protect the kids from the air raids of the Americans. So those who had relatives out in the country would be moved there, and those who didn't would be placed in the group movements of the cities. The biggest strength of this movie, in my opinion, is its believability. Obviously, the fact that it's based on a novel by a person who actually lived through the war helps create that sense of believability in the events that are taking place. But as we all know, just because something is based on a true story, that doesn't have to mean that the events in the movie or the story they are telling has to be true. But what also helps with the believability as well is that a lot of the events are fairly everyday-like and mundane. It makes sense, since for a lot of people, the war wasn't that close, and when the US invaded, it kind of came as a bit of a shock. This is highlighted at the start by the fact that the only thing we hear about the war, except for what is told on the radio, comes in the form of the letters sent to the family from Kayoko's uncle, who is currently stationed in China, and for a while, things were fairly calm there. The movie is not trying to play up the danger they are in at the beginning. Some of the characters are actually doing the opposite, and downplaying the danger. Actually sitting there and listening to the characters talking, you're gonna think they are downright naive, since we know what happened later. What I think this movie lacks though, is honestly the climax. That's not to say that the movie doesn't have a climax, because it does. It just lacks a little bit since we have been so removed from the situation for almost the entire movie. It's a good movie, don't get me wrong, and I like that it serves as a different alternative to those who can't stomach the more gruesome movies, like Barefoot Gen, but I still think that the movie removes itself a bit too much from the things that were going on during the war. I would at least have liked to see them put a bit more of a focus on the kind of messed up ways that the people had to support the country's war efforts, especially towards the end. Like I said earlier, they did that a little bit by showing us how the family would have to donate all the things they didn't need to the army, but I feel like they could have done more with that. By the time this gets relevant again, Kayoko has to move away, and we get to see how they had to ration their food so as to not eat too much. I appreciate these things for what they are, but I still think they could have done something more with it. Because when the bombing finally happened, and we get to see the aftermath, and the title of the movie finally becomes obvious, you do feel bad, but I still think they could have done more to build this up. So who is this movie for? The way I see it, I'd say this movie is mostly for those who wouldn't know what it was like to live in Japan during the war, and who aren't able to deal with the heavier movies like Barefoot Gen. That is not to say that this movie isn't heavy in its own right, but it's not as shocking and in your face about it. It is a war drama, but with a lot of slice of life elements that wouldn't be out of place in your normal cute girls doing cute stuff shows. It's just that there's more of a sinister backdrop to this movie. So yeah, if you're interested in stories from people who lived through World War II in Japan, and you don't think you can stomach the more gruesome Barefoot Gen, then I'd say give this movie a shot. Alright, so those were my thoughts on Ushiro no Shoumen Daare, a really fascinating movie that takes on a bit more of a removed look of the war. I don't think it's quite as good as Barefoot Gen was, but it's still a strong movie in its own right. So if it sounds interesting to you, then you should definitely check it out. Anyways, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, then don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe for more anime related content from the Anime Top Scholar. Peace!